Okay, well, thank you guys for joining us today for the next webinar in our series on livestock guardian dogs. I would like to thank the Sheep and Goat Predator Management Board for providing funding for this position. Also, Dr. Eden, our director of the Research Center here in San Angelo, and Robert Pritz for helping us out again, getting everything set up with the Zoom meeting for today. Our sponsor today is Lone Star Tracking again. If you're looking for any type of GPS trackers, contact Thomas or Mark over there at Lone Star Tracking. He can get you set up. And we're also trying out one of their new solar trackers. So if you have any questions on that, check our Facebook page, and I'll be making updates on that new tracker that we have. So our speaker today is Tammy Terry. She's a law partner at OSHA Bergman, Watanabe, and Burton in Houston. She has a BS from Texas Tech and a law degree from California Western School of Law. She's an IP litigator and a registered patent attorney with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. Her practice includes IP litigation and dispute resolution, representing companies on the cutting edge of technology in a variety of industries and disciplines. She has trial experience in a variety of complex commercial litigation cases, including first and second chair trial experience, and jury trials in federal and state court. Her professional honors include top lawyer from H Texas Magazine, top 50 women in PTAB trial list from the PTAB Bar Association, and Texas Rising Star for the Texas Super Lawyers. Ms. Terry has experience in her personal life with livestock protection dogs. She's owned Akbosh dogs in the past and has been involved in the Akbosh Dog Association of America. One housekeeping thing real quick. If you guys have questions during the webinar, if you can please post those in the chat room, and we'll get those all answered at the end of the webinar today. So with that, Tammy, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you again for being here today. Oh, I think you're muted still, Tammy.
It helps if I click the mute button. Thank you, Bill, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. My name is Tammy Terry, and I am here to present to you what little bit I can share about livestock protection dogs and the law. I recognize at least one name in the audience who will have seen the vast majority of this presentation before, because I've given it at the Akbosh Dog Association of America annual meeting, which is, an organization that I was very, very pleased to have the honor of working with for a little bit of time when I was living on a ranch and working with Akbosh dogs. I want to start with a couple of disclaimers. As you heard in my intro, I am not an animal lawyer. I am an intellectual property litigator, which means that what I'm sharing with you today is, based on research that I, did in my independent time, kind of on a volunteer basis. But if you have serious questions requiring an animal law specialist, it's not me. I would be happy to, make an introduction to someone who may be able to help you with something like that. But anything that I do say today, it's based on this bit of research. It's for informational purposes only. I am not providing legal advice, and I hope that I can answer questions at the end of this talk, but I'm not going to make grand promises. So hopefully you learn a little bit of something, and it's at least mildly entertaining and doesn't put you to sleep. So let me start with, when I started looking at issues specific to the legalities of either owning or breeding livestock protection dogs, one of the first things I looked at was, well, are there any kind of federal laws that we have to be careful of or that we need to be aware of? And what kind of separate state laws might apply? Now, because I'm in the state of Texas, I'm going to be focused on Texas state laws, but please do be aware that if you are in another state and logging into this presentation, there will be laws that may be different than the ones that I'm going to talk about today. And it is important to make sure and check your local state laws. But what I'd like to start with is a bit of an overview on the federal side first, before we go into the state side. So on the federal level, what we do know is that there are quite a variety of various animal protection laws, and these are really sets of legislation that were put into place to protect animals in one way, shape, or form. Some of these may sound familiar to you, and I'm not intending to go very deeply into any one of these, but I do want to touch on them because, we often come across these, at least in the news, and sometimes in, just casual conversation when you're talking about, well, what laws affect, the animals that we deal with. So the Animal Welfare Act is one of the first federal laws that you may or may not be aware of. This is one that is enforced by the Department of Agriculture. This act mainly involves talking about animals and how they're kept in zoos and used in laboratories, as well as animals that are sold commercially and bred commercially. There are aspects of this act that are going to apply to, what we know as puppy mills. So there may be some aspects of the Animal Welfare Act that may be interesting to you. There's also what's known as the 28-hour law. So any of you who are in the business of transporting animals across state lines may be aware of this. And this is basically a law that prohibits you from transporting animals interstate in a vehicle or some sort of a vessel for more than 28 consecutive hours without unloading the animals to feed them, water them, etc. There are other specific requirements that are applicable to how you transport animals, but that's a 28-hour law, and some of you may be familiar with that if you've ever done any kind of livestock transport across state lines. There's also a set of laws referred to as the Humane Slaughter Act, and some of you may also be familiar with those as producers. This act really, it was first enacted back in 1958. It was subsequently amended in 1978, and then more recently, in 2002, there was the 2002 Farm Act that really kind of said, hey, we want to enforce this law. And essentially, as the name implies, it governs the slaughter of animals and requires that it be done humanely. There are certain requirements that have to be followed when you are slaughtering animals, unless it's for religious purposes. So when we're talking about the commercial sale of meat, there are certain things that you have to do in order to comply with this act. There's also the Endangered Species Act, which most people have heard of in some way, shape, or form, even if it's through solicitations for donations on TV. And this protects endangered species, those species who are either actually endangered or threatened. The whole aim of this act is to protect them from going extinct. So there are parts of the act that prohibit killing or taking into possession certain types of animals, depending on their status on the endangered species list. And then finally, and most recently, this was actually just enacted at the end of November 2019. It's an act referred to as the Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act. And this act actually makes it a criminal offense to engage in certain acts of animal cruelty. And you can face prison time, felony charges, and those kinds of things if you're found to have violated this act. Aside from these kinds of the category of animal protection laws that I just went over, there are also on the federal side, there are various importation rules and regulations. And these, of course, have to do with the importation of animals into the United States. But there are no federal laws that actually specifically govern livestock protection dogs. So because of that, what we really need to look at, we need to go more to the local level and first look at the state level of laws, which I referred to a little while ago. And because we are in Texas, I'm going to refer to Texas laws. So what we see in Texas law are a few different categories. There are some laws that relate to domestic animals, including dogs. There are also laws that relate to livestock. But again, we don't have actual laws that are specific to livestock protection dogs or livestock guard dogs. By the way, I refer to these dogs as LPDs, or livestock protection dogs. That is a term that is synonymous with livestock guard dogs, and you may hear other people talk about livestock guard dogs. I mean the same thing. It has in more recent years become preferred in some circles to use protection instead of guard. It has connotations that feel better to some people. I feel more comfortable referring to them as LPDs or livestock protection dogs, but it's not inaccurate if you hear somebody talk about livestock guard dogs. We're talking about the same thing. So in Texas, we don't actually have laws that are specific to livestock protection dogs. We do have, though, some laws that address dogs as they're used in agriculture. And here in a moment, we'll be able to take a look at some of those laws more specifically. But we're going to start with taking a step back and looking a little bit at how Texas regulates animals. So what I have here on this slide in Chapter 822 of the Texas Health and Safety Code, we have some provisions that refer to the, quote, regulation of animals. And what this has to do with is how really the local governments can regulate animals. It also, of import to us today, explains the law of what we call, quote, dangerous dogs. And of course, this is terminology that came about quite some time ago. And, you know, if anybody was to revisit this, they may or may not want to, choose to use different terms, but that's the language we're left with. So, you know, what are we looking at here? You know, one of the questions that, you know, came to mind when I was looking at, you know, what are the legalities of LPD ownership? You know, it's a common issue that owners face. You know, what if my LPD doesn't stay on my property? You know, are there laws that, you know, can be violated or that I can be held responsible for if that happens? So, well, in Section 822, at Section .012, there is actually a provision that applies to certain dogs and coyotes who are prohibited from running at large. Now, note, you always have to pay attention specifically to what the language says, right? So in this particular provision of the law, what it talks about is an owner, a keeper, or a person in control of a dog or coyote that the owner, person, or keeper knows is accustomed to run, worry, or kill livestock, domestic animals, or fowls. That person may not permit that dog or coyote to run at large. So if you know that you have a dog that causes problems for livestock or for other people's domestic animals or fowls, you're not allowed to allow that dog to run at large. You have to keep that dog fenced. What happens if you don't? Well, according to this particular section of the law, somebody who violates this section does commit an offense, and they may be punished by a fine of not more than $100. So every time your dog, you know, if you know that your dog tends to cause worry, as the language says, or, you know, runs after livestock or other people's animals, every time that happens, you could be fined up to $100. Now, what if, God forbid, your LPD actually attacks a neighbor? What happens then? Well, another subsection of Section 822 called attack by a dog addresses that very issue. So under this law, and you know, there's a lot of language up on the slide. I tried to kind of highlight in red the language that really stands out as most important to distill this down. But what we know from Section 822.005 is that someone who owns a dog, and if the person with criminal negligence allows that dog, or knows that the dog, makes an unprovoked attack on another person that occurs somewhere other than the owner's own property, and that causes serious bodily injury or death, or the person knows that his or her dog is a dangerous dog, and that dangerous dog makes an unprovoked attack that causes serious bodily injury or death, that actually is a third-degree felony in Texas. That is, unless, of course, the attack causes death, in which case that turns into a second-degree felony, which is even more serious. This law provides that one of the remedies that could be availed of is the court could order that dog who attacked the neighbor could be destroyed by there are certain people that are allowed to do that, listed under subsection 004. And that, a person who owns such a dog could be prosecuted under this section or any other law, and they can be, prosecuted to the full extent of the law. So that having been said, however, there is another subsection that does provide that an owner may use as an affirmative defense, and that means that they may defend themselves essentially. If they are able to, at the time of the conduct that has been charged, if they can show that the owner and the dog were engaged in a farming or ranching activity, including herding livestock, typically performed by a working dog on a farm or ranch. So what does that mean? Possibly there's an exception for livestock protection dogs. Now, for sure, we know that there's an exception for herding dogs, which isn't necessarily the same thing. Most of us who own livestock protection dogs know that. But, do we know for sure? It's a little bit ambiguous because as we may know, there's the letter of the law as we see it in the statutes. And then there's, of course, the way that courts actually apply the laws when they're faced with real cases, real people, and in this case, real dogs. So we're going to talk about a couple cases here in a little while, so you can see just how different courts can apply the same kind of law. But what if, okay, let's get away from attacking a person. You know, we understand my dog attacks someone. For the most part, there's probably going to be some consequences that I'm going to have to face as a dog owner. What if my LPD attacks a neighbor's dog or livestock, however? So there's another separate subsection under Chapter 822 that addresses dogs or coyotes that attack animals. And under this section, what they provide is that, look, if you have a dog that is attacking or is about to attack or recently has attacked livestock, of course, they also add domestic animals or fowls in all of these laws. That dog can actually be killed by any person who witnesses the attack or the attacked animal's owner or a person acting on behalf of the owner if the owner or person has knowledge of the attack. So this means that, you know, we as dog owners, if you own a dog, one of these dogs, you are in a situation that you really, I mean, it would be most prudent to make sure that you don't allow a situation like that to arise. Now, it does say here under this section that a person who kills a dog, as provided by in this section, is not liable for damages to the owner. So if my LPD goes and attacks my neighbor's livestock and my neighbor witnesses and kills my dog, my neighbor does not owe me for that dog. I mean, that's just, that's the way that it is here in Texas. Now, under subsection C, we see that a person who discovers on the person's property a dog known or suspected of having killed livestock, domestic animals, or fowls, may detain or impound the dog and return it to its owner or deliver the dog to the local animal control authority. That assumes that you have a local animal control authority. I know that where I used to live, we didn't have one. I lived in a county that had a population of about 3,000 people total scattered throughout the county, and there definitely were not the resources for that. In the parts where I lived, it was more likely I was going to run into the subsection A situation, not the subsection C situation. But maybe some of us are luckier than others. Now, under subsection D, the owner or the keeper or person in control of the dog that's known to have attacked, they have to control that dog in a manner approved by the local animal control authority. So you can't just do whatever you want. You have to actually follow the law. And then finally, under subsection E, we learn that you don't have to have a hunting license to kill one of these dogs. So if a dog has attacked livestock and the person who witnesses that attack kills that dog, they don't have to have had a hunting license, apparently. Now, there are other Texas laws. We're moving along and away from attacks, and we're just going to talk about some other Texas health and safety code provisions. You know, as anybody who's owned a dog is probably aware, there are rabies, vaccinations that are required under Texas law. There's Chapter 826 under the Texas Health and Safety Code that is dedicated to this, and it will tell you exactly what rabies is, what animals have to be vaccinated, the actual regulations that apply to these vaccination requirements, and how those vaccinations have to be reported, and how in the situation of a dog that does show symptoms of having rabies, how that dog has to be quarantined. Under Chapter 828 of the Texas Health and Safety Code, we have provisions relating to dog and cat sterilization. So under certain circumstances, there is a requirement that certain animals be sterilized. Those requirements are beyond the scope of today's lecture, but if you are interested in learning more about that, you can look up Chapter 828 of the Texas Health and Safety Code. Now, so what if we don't have a situation of the LPD going onto my neighbor's property, but instead we have animals trespassing onto my property, and my LPD is just doing what my LPD is supposed to do, and that is guarding, his or her herd? What happens if, my LPD ends up attacking and killing a trespassing animal? Well, I looked for cases on this, and I wasn't able to find any cases on point in Texas. Now, there are a couple old cases that do relate to the protection of property. And for some reason, they seem to be, and it may become more evident to you as we talk through these, but the difference in the outcomes in these cases really seem to have to do with the difference between whether or not the owner had a good fence or no fence or a bad fence. So let's take a look at these. The first case that we'll look at, it's called Champion versus Vincent, and this is an old case from 1858. It went all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court. And in this case, Mr. Champion sued his neighbor Vincent for shooting his hogs who were rooting in Vincent's garden. So Champion had hogs. Those hogs trespassed over onto Vincent's property, and Vincent shot the hogs because the hogs were rooting in his garden. They went to court, and Vincent was found to have had, it was known or brought into evidence, that is, that Vincent had a bad fence. Whatever bad means, that is literally the language from the case. The trial court, however, ended up finding for Vincent and basically awarding Vincent because Champion, in the court's view, didn't deserve to get any money damages for Vincent shooting his hogs because, according to the court, the findings just, there wasn't sufficient evidence there. Now, when this case went up to the Texas Supreme Court, the Supreme Court actually reversed and found that Champion should have been entitled to damages for his hogs. That basically, because Vincent had a bad fence, it was Vincent's fault that those hogs went into Vincent's garden in the first place, and therefore Vincent didn't have a right to shoot those hogs because he should have had a better fence. So that was the way that the Texas Supreme Court saw that situation back then. Would it turn out the same way today? I don't know. But here we have another case, which was about 50 years later. This one did not go all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court, but it did go to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. So this was a criminal case. It was Huffman versus State. In this situation, Huffman was convicted of unlawfully killing cattle. Now, the Court of Criminal Appeals recognized that evidence showed that the cattle that Huffman killed were known fence breakers, and that Huffman himself had a good fence. And this is, again, case law language. And he shot the cattle to protect his crop. In that situation, his conviction at the trial court was reversed. So again, we have this distinction and this emphasis on the fence. So take home lesson, you need to have a good fence. It's gonna behoove you anyway for many other reasons. But apparently, in terms of the question of whether or not you can be liable for what happens when there are trespassing animals, it will depend, in Texas at least, on how good your fence is. So getting away from the trespassing situations and LPDs, attacking, neighbors and other livestock, we want to shift over now. The next part of this talk is to look at breeding LPDs, because some of us in the audience may be doing that. And the question becomes, are there laws that apply to me as a breeder? The answer to that is yes, there are. So there is an act called the Texas Dog or Cat Breeders Act. It's part of the Occupations Code. And this act lays out a whole panoply of requirements and details for people who are considered to be breeders. And we're going to talk in a moment about what that really means. But under this act, just generally speaking, there are licenses for breeders. Under this act, there are required facility inspections that do occur every 18 months. Inspectors who are designated in a specific way by the government are required to notify law enforcement if there's any evidence that they find of animal cruelty or neglect. This act also provides that a dog or cat breeder that provides training for them, and also enforcement that can be used for promoting consumer awareness of this particular chapter of the act. There's also provisions to support education, training, and other enforcement efforts. So who exactly is covered by this law? Well, we know from the slide before, we're talking about licensed breeders. What this really means is a dog or a cat breeder who holds a license issued under this chapter. Okay, well, what does that mean? That means a person who possesses 11 or more adult intact female animals and is engaged in the business of breeding those animals for direct or indirect sale, or for exchange in return for consideration. In other words, if you're exchanging them for some other good or service. And if that person sells or exchanges or offers to sell or exchange not fewer than 20 animals in a given year. So I don't know exactly how it is that they came up with this specific number of 11 or more adult intact female animals, but that's the requirement. So basically, if you have 10, you're not subject to this law. If you have 11 or more, you are considered to be a dog or cat breeder, and there's a whole host of requirements that kick in under this law. So what are the license requirements? Well, under the Texas Commission of Licensing and Regulation and the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, you have to submit paperwork showing that you have certain facilities and that you comply with their requirements. You fill out the application, you submit it to the government, And then you have someone, they send someone out who conducts a pre-license inspection. You're also required as a breeder to maintain certain records. You have to show that you are complying with these regulations on a consistent basis. You have to have your license on display at your facility. You have to submit to an annual accounting. So once a year, the Texas Commission of Licensing and Regulation or the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, they can ask to see your books and you have to show them and they will conduct an accounting. If they discover that you are not in compliance with their requirements, then there may be, consequences that you have to face. They also can come by and inspect your property. They have periodic inspections that can be, as frequently as every 18 months. So we know what, qualifies one as a breeder now, but interestingly, there is an exemption for certain persons who breed special purpose dogs. So remember how earlier I said that there weren't specific LPD laws, but that there are laws that appear to apply to dogs who are used for agricultural purposes? Well, we've arrived at that part of the presentation. So here, under section 802.005, this section applies only to a dog bred with the intent that it be used primarily for, under 1, herding livestock as defined by another section in the Agriculture Code, or other agricultural uses. They also provide for dogs that are bred for hunting, including tracking, chasing, pointing, flushing, or retrieving game, or competing in field trials. But what we're really interested in is the language or other agricultural uses, because that seems to be an area where we may be able to comfortably fit livestock protection dogs. Now, subsection B says that this chapter does not apply to a person to the extent the person breeds dogs described by subsection A for personal use. A person described by this subsection may conduct direct or indirect sales or exchanges in return for consideration of dogs described by subsection A. So basically, we're talking about whether or not you are commercially selling, you're breeding for the purpose of selling rather than for personal use. Now, in subsection D of this same law, we see that dogs that are described by subsection A, which is what defines these special purpose dogs, these dogs may not be counted for purposes of determining the number of adult intact female animals possessed by a person described by section 802.002. In other words, these dogs don't count when we're talking about whether or not a person is designated a breeder for purposes of having a license under the subsections that we just read before. So another question that comes up when we're talking about the laws that could affect LPDs, particularly if you are ever in a situation where you're selling puppies, is there a minimum age that you have to sell puppies? If you're selling puppies, is there a minimum age that you have to wait to sell them? I mean, many people probably heard this, but it is actually a law. It's not just a rumor or a preferred custom. Under section 91.113 of the Texas Administrative Code, Standards of Care, Sales and Transfers, it does provide that a licensed breeder shall not sell, trade, or give away an animal before the animal is at least 8 weeks of age. Now, of course, there may be the question, well, what if I'm not a licensed breeder under that subsection? Well, you might not have this provision of the law apply, but that might not make it a good idea anyway to be selling animals, particularly puppies, under the age of 8 weeks. So, does Texas have a puppy lemon law? This was a question that was actually posed to me at some point by someone just in casual conversation. I thought, I don't know. Let me look into this. And what are we talking about when we say a puppy lemon law? Well, if you pay money for a purebred dog and you take that dog home and then that dog turns out to, say die within a day or, something awful like that. Much like a car lemon law, is there some sort of a law that protects you in that situation, or from a breeder's perspective that you have to be aware of in that situation? Well, apparently there's not one specifically that is a quote puppy lemon law, but there are laws in Texas that do protect consumers who do find that what they bought is not exactly what they were told they were getting. So up here on this slide, we have different sections of the Texas Business and Commerce Code that protect consumers. We have the laws of express and implied warranties that apply, as well as what we refer to as the DTPA, which stands for the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices and Consumer Protection Act. This has a whole number of activities that you're not supposed to engage in, and that conversely, consumers are protected from out in the marketplace. That, you know, there are various remedies that can be availed of if this situation arises. Now, I've talked about federal law, I've talked about state law. What I haven't yet talked about, and what I really do want to highlight, is you really need to be checking your local ordinances, particularly if you are in a rural area. I mean, the reality of it is, what's going to govern whether or not you're going to get in trouble, so to speak, with your dog is really going to amount to what's happening locally. So what I have here on this slide is, this was a little bit of a news blitz a couple of years ago, where the owners of a Great Pyrenees named Sheriff, they were cited locally for violating noise ordinances in Plumas County. What happened was a neighbor filed a citizen's complaint, and the owners of the dog were slapped with a $1,000 fine. They then went to the papers, and there was a little bit of media on it. I tried to find out whatever ended up happening with all that, and of course it was only newsworthy, you know, for a little moment, and then interest, I guess, subsided. But the point is that it doesn't matter that there may not be a state law or a federal law that applies to a situation. There could be a local ordinance, and even though you may think you're okay based on all other things, you need to check that local ordinance, and it is usually a good idea to have a good relationship with local law enforcement, because when those ordinances are broken and you have neighbors complaining, it helps to have better relationships with the people who are actually enforcing those ordinances. That's just a suggestion from, you know, having had some experience out there where, you know, those relationships really can help or they can hurt. Now, a lot of the stuff that I've talked about, you can find copies of the law itself, the laws that I've talked about themselves, at these links that I have up here on this slide. And my understanding is that this presentation will be provided in some format to those of you who are interested in. So you can go to these links and you can do research on your own to answer some of the questions that you may have that may be burning after today. But that is really all that I have to present on the topic. I am happy to entertain questions. Like I said at the beginning, I can't promise that I'm going to be able to give in-depth and complete answers, but if there have been any questions that have been asked in the chat, we can, you know, certainly address those at this time.
We do have some questions that are in the chat. Let me scroll back up here and see where we started off with. So one of the questions, and I'm not sure if you can answer this one, but they were asking about issues of tethering when it's cold outside with the dogs, and if they have to be placed inside or in some sort of a heated space. I know that's an issue in some other states, and I don't know if you can answer that question for them here or not.
Yeah, so I don't know specifically, because I didn't see anything in my research specifically addressing that, but what I would imagine is that that's going to fall under, you know, more of kind of the animal cruelty and those kinds of laws, which I didn't really dive into on the state level. And there may even be local ordinances that relate to that. I did not see anything though specifically on that issue, and so I'm sorry, I can't really speak specifically to that, Deborah.
The next question, when you were speaking about the fence laws and how those cases turned out, they wanted to know if that's a fence out requirement rather than a fence in requirement on those animals.
Those cases did not speak about a distinction between fence out and fence in. It was literally focusing on the condition of the fence. So, I mean, as far as those cases were concerned, and that may have been, you know, just because those specific cases, you know, were so unique, but they didn't talk about, you know, the requirements of either fencing out versus fencing in.
Next question, how do they find out if there's a breeder law in their specific state?
So I would look for, I would literally start with Google searching, you know, looking to see for, you know, breeder laws in, you know, whatever. There is a link that, let's see, the University of Michigan has a lot of resources for a lot of different states. And so they may already have applicable laws collected on their website. And that's the www.animallaw.info website. So you might start there and look under your state and see if you can find that organized by topic. I would recommend that as well.
Okay. The next one is if you live in a city but are a ranch, will the number of dog restrictions affect you at the same level? If you are on over 30 acres, specifically, can they count your working dogs as pets?
That's going to depend on where you are. That is going to depend specifically on where you are, because there are local ordinances that are different depending on what county you're in. And so that is not a state level issue. That's going to be a local ordinance issue.
Okay. And if anybody didn't see this one, yes, we will be providing the presentation today. It'll go onto our YouTube channel as soon as we're able to get that posted, and you'll be able to get any of these links or these different Texas statutes and stuff that are on the books for you to go ahead and take a look at. Let's see, we got another one here. It says our neighbor with a special needs child complains that the livestock guardian dogs bark too much when they check their mail, and they bark too much at their special needs son when he waits for the bus. And they claim that the dogs scare the child. The dogs are enclosed behind a fence and are only barking. They're not causing any harm. They want us to move the dogs legally. We don't have to move them, or do we?
So that depends on the local noise ordinances. One of the last slides that I touched on that talked about always check your local ordinances had a situation where the reason that the dog owners got in trouble was because the neighbors complained about a violation of the noise ordinance, the local noise ordinance due to the barking. So you really need to check and see, what are your local ordinances that have to do with noise, because it is possible that if they complain to the right person, and you don't have a better relationship with that person than they do, that you might get in trouble, and you might have to move the dogs due to the noise. But I don't know specifically in your area. Actually, I don't know specifically where I am, because I haven't looked at that lately. I haven't looked into that issue here. But it could be that you may be required to move them if there's a local noise ordinance that they complain about.
Next question, let's see here. Texas Right to Farm.
Bill, while you're getting to that, I'd like to ask Terry a question. Well, first, thanks for that presentation. That was really good. There were some things in there that I need to be reminded of, and some new things. So appreciate that. I do have a question on how would you define that suspects attack? We've had a couple of instances where dogs have been moving onto neighbors' properties, and the neighbor is losing livestock. It's our belief that the dogs are over there trying to protect their livestock, but they are associating the dogs being there and a loss of livestock. One, do they have the right to kill them if they suspect it without seeing them in the act? A follow-up to that, what would they be liable for if they couldn't prove that they saw it? And then I guess the second part for that is really defining that suspects attack. If they do suspect it and they follow the law and they take them to the shelter, then where do we go from there? So I'm sorry, I'm kind of bouncing around there, but I wanted to try to lay that out and get your thoughts.
Sure. No, thank you for the questions. And I can't promise you're going to like my answer, because the answer is it depends. The language suspects, it really is going to boil down to, what are they able to reasonably prove to the person who's making the decision about whether or not they complied with the law. And so, if they, if they have evidence that is more probable than not to show that they reasonably suspected that your dogs were the cause of their livestock loss, then they might be able to, follow the rest of those requirements and take that dog to the shelter. And then at that point, whether or not you're able to get your dog back, I don't know the answer to that, because I don't have that, like the rest of that law handy in front of me. But what I will say is that it is usually best, where possible, to deal with what really gives rise to the biggest problems are human-human relationship problems, and to the best that you can mend those relationships or improve those relationships and open up communication so that they're coming to you and you're able to have some hope of resolving an issue before they go running to the authorities, the better off you're going to be. In addition to that, knowing your local law enforcement can be really helpful, and getting a better understanding of, really what are they concerned about, and sometimes in some communities, frankly, law enforcement doesn't want to be bothered with, ranchers complaining at each other about their dogs, and so, to have a better sense of that is going to help you better predict. But unfortunately, there's not a clear black and white answer, because it is all in the factual details. And what is one person going to be successful in persuading the decision maker, who is usually the local judge, when it comes down to it, or, sometimes the sheriff.
So I guess the question I had is, so if the producer had GPS trackers, for instance, on their dog, and they could pull up that information and show that, it was just one time, for instance, that the dog wandered over there, then we would have some legal grounds then to say, hey, well, you shouldn't have shot the dog, or whatever happened then, correct?
That would definitely help. That would be evidence that would be helpful, to the producer. Any kind of data that you can gather, any kind of real evidence that you can show that, look, you did not have a basis to suspect that my dog was causing worry or running your livestock, or whatever the case may be. If you have cameras set up where you can actually get video, showing that at these times that your neighbor is concerned that your dogs are nowhere near their livestock, I mean, that obviously is also going to be helpful evidence. If you have camera footage that shows other animals that are not yours causing the problems on your neighbor's property, even better. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Any kind of data, GPS data, game cameras that take pictures of, at opportune times, all of that kind of information can be helpful.
So one of the questions that came up in the chat is they're wanting to know if there's any right to farm laws that apply or protect livestock protection dogs.
I haven't seen it. So I don't know the answer to that question. I didn't see anything specific to livestock guardian or to livestock protection dogs. Not in Texas, at least, to be precise. There may be in other states.
Sorry, people are just answering some of the questions through each other here, it looks like. I guess one of the questions here, if they're actually an ag operation by the county's review, would that not cover the noise issue?
Not sure if I understand the, and I was trying to look at the chat to see where you were reading the question from.
I'm down towards the bottom.
The Texas right to, are you talking about the Texas right to farm statute provides that no nuisance claim may be brought against an agricultural operation that has been in operation for 1 year or more prior to the date of the lawsuit, so long as the conditions complained of have not changed since the established date of the operation. Okay. So I have no reason to dispute that. The situation that usually arises, though, is when there is a neighbor that suddenly is upset by, loud barking dogs. But yeah, I mean, you may be able to avail yourself of the defense under that, that particular provision.
Or are there any other questions out there from the audience today? It says somebody has 15,000 acres. Fencing in the dogs is our goal, but not always practical. Oh, sorry, Reed, that was your response to the fencing question there. I guess the question is what does a good fence consist of? I don't know if you have an answer for that.
Yeah, I'm not qualified to answer that question either. Because, the cases that I read also were from 1858 and 1908. And what was considered a good fence and a bad fence then may not be the same as it is today. And I suspect that's largely going to be dependent upon the local decision maker, the local judge in a particular case. But I don't think that there is a bright line, quote, good fence, bad fence. Not anything that I saw. But, if someone is interested in researching that question further and letting me know what the answer is to that, I'd love to hear it.
Okay, well, I guess we're going to get this wrapped up here today. Thank you again, Tammy, for coming out and presenting for us. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank again Dr. Redden, the Predator Board, for providing funding for this position for me, Robert Pritz, and our sponsor, Lone Star Tracking. This presentation will be posted onto YouTube in the next few days. So if you guys are looking for that, I will send out a link to everybody that all registered for the webinar today. So again, thank you guys very much, and sure appreciate your support. We will have another webinar in July. Currently it looks like the topic will be canine reproduction. So thank you guys very much for attending today. Have a good day.